joining me today in my garden. I'm Liz Davey and you're watching A Walk in the Garden on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable Television. These episodes are filmed in my garden in Norfolk and also in my kitchen as we go in at the end of the show and make a few things, usually using some of the things from the garden. I'm starting out in the herb garden, and things have really, in the last 2 weeks, with a little sun and a little rain, really come around. The sorrel is starting to go to seed, and what I'll probably want to do with that is just snap off these parts that are going to seed, and we'll add those to the compost, and hopefully we can keep some new leaves coming on the sorrel. Rhubarb is ready to pick. This is an old one, and it's a green rhubarb. I have other plants that are red, which are a little more attractive in some dishes, but the green is still very tasty and does make a lovely pie. The Egyptian onion is starting to put on little blossoms. The chives are in blossom, and you can use not only the stalk of the chives, the leaves, but you can also use the blossoms. But be aware that the blossoms have a much stronger flavor than the leaves that are chopped up. And if you do use the blossoms, separate the little florets from them before you use them. A whole chive blossom is just a little too much in just about anything you want to prepare. I've gotten out my little labels and my herb garden sign, and it's time to plant the tenderer herbs. This is a lemon verbena, which I'm going to put in, but I also have some different kinds of basil. I plant basil in my vegetable garden as well for a long-term crop, but I like to have a little bit up here in the herb garden just for an early taste. I have a little more parsley, again, something I plant down in the other garden, the vegetable garden, but for just a little bit early. I also have a dwarf curry plant, which is an attractive addition to the front of the herb garden. And it does smell like curry, very much. And it has a vibrant color and a yellow flower. But today I'm going to plant one of the lemon verbena, and since I have my own little tags for it, I'll leave the tag behind. Be sure to read the tags when you buy plants. It'll tell you whether they need sun or shade, and anything else that you need to know about it. Lemon verbena is a tender perennial, and so you can't plant it too very early in the season, or you'll lose it to one of the later frosts, or at least cool temperatures. Likes a temperature above 50 at night. You're going to hear me say that throughout this show, because any of the tender plants, you need to wait until the temperature at night is pretty reliably above 50. That's been a little hard this spring, but I'm going to dig out a nice little hole for it, fill it in well. If the roots had been really circling around in the pot, I would have separated them. They were not at this point. But then we'll give it a good drink, which is also important. We'll keep watering these things that I put in the next few days. In order to give them a good start. I have a fennel plant here, which has some nice bronze new growth. The mints are ready to use. All the thymes can be used right now. Again, we can use sorrel still. I have lemon and balm and lime balm. They're slightly different plant. And we also have a lot of sweet woodruff. I have that out here because it's a little shadier under the tree, along with some apple mint. And I also use it as a ground cover in my shade garden. It's a lovely little plant. It has these little white flowers in the spring, and it is the herb which is used to make May wine. It's mixed with the wine and finished off usually with a bit of champagne. You can also make a mock May wine using white grape juice and just seltzer or soda water. And that's pretty good too, and it's very refreshing. Other things are coming up. All the various types of mint. I have several. I have a Kentucky mint. I have a mint julep mint. anise hyssop, which has a very anisey flavor and can also be used in cooking very nicely. The sage that I cut way back because it had winter damage, and it's now coming right back and doing well. We'll have a lot of sage to harvest a little later on. Oregano is ready to use as well. Well known as the pizza herb. This is a Greek oregano, which is one of the stronger types. This is a more common oregano. Isn't as strong, but it does have pretty pink flowers. This one is tarragon, and again, that can be picked right now and used. It has a slightly licorice flavor. I also have the rosemary we planted a couple weeks ago is doing well. That takes a little bit more cold than some of the other things. And this is a lavender. Again, I cut that back a bit, probably needs a few more stalks cut down, and it's coming back nicely and should bloom in a few weeks, if not a month. That's pretty much it for the herb garden. Again, I'll be adding more herbs as I go, making a few more signs. The only plants that I really identify with the sign are my herbs, so that I know what they are, and I just think it looks nice in the herb garden to have them identified. So that's what I do. Let's move on to the perennial garden and see what's blooming and what we can do over there. We're starting to get some color in the perennial garden, and the plants are really starting to do well. If they aren't in bloom, they're at least showing some buds. We have lilies that I've been watching for those red lily beetles and keeping them squashed and off the plants. And so I do have lilies that have leaves and are going to have blossoms. This is the aster I planted last time. You may notice that it moved position from when I planted it because I decided I wanted it here instead of further back. Doing a little more reading, I discovered that instead of being 36 inches, it was only 18 inch. So I wanted to keep it towards the front. I planted several alliums. I have several alliums. And alliums are in the onion family. And that means the deer don't like them one bit, which is a big advantage in Norfolk. And I planted 5 of these around the garden, just in the same position all the way around, just to see what they looked like. And I may plant more of them in the same spots because I really like the way they look. This is one of the larger ones. I also have smaller ones, and we'll see those as we move through the garden and as they come into bloom. Almost everything's up. Our daffodils and tulips are gone, but other bulbs, the alliums and the nectar garlic, are still ready to bloom and blooming. I leave the daffodils alone. It's very hard not to cut them down or braid them up and put a stone on them, but they do need to have their foliage ripen naturally in order to get more daffodils next year. One of the things I did here in a couple spots is to plant a daylily near the dying daffodil foliage, and that should get a little larger and help hide it when this foliage actually falls down and starts to turn brown. It is unsightly, however, it needs to do that in order to form flowers next year. Again, more lilies, and I do keep check of those. We have a few holes, but no beetles to be seen today. And we will watch them to make sure we don't have any as time goes on and they start to bloom. This is a geranium, and it doesn't look anything like the geraniums that you're getting at the nurseries right now, which are annual geraniums. This is a perennial geranium. They come in a variety of colors, mostly pinks, whites, and some lending towards purple. This one's a wargrave pink, and they will bloom pretty much all summer as long as they get a good amount of water and some sunshine. This is the nectar garlic I was talking about, and it's ready to spring into bloom. It will have kind of, well, they look like fireworks. The blooms kind of come out in a starburst type effect and hang down. They're kind of an interesting plant, and they add a little interest to the garden. Campanula And again, another daylily interspersed with that daffodil. The daylily hopefully will take over soon. The plant behind it is phlomis, and then in a couple of weeks that will be in bloom. It's a funny little yellow plant that grows, it blossoms in layers, so it adds some interest to the garden. Behind it, the baptisia is just starting to come to bloom. Baptisia is a native plant, and it also is a host for several butterflies, I believe. And so it's a nice thing to have in your garden if you want to have some butterflies. Iris, some of them have come out, others will come out in the succeeding days. There are several types of iris in this garden. The miniature iris bloomed 2 weeks ago. The German iris, or bearded iris, as it's also called, like the purple one back there, and then we have some white ones later on, and pink here in front that are nicely budded. Those bloom at this time, and then the Siberian iris can bloom either now or a little bit later. And so they'll be available in about 2 weeks. We have a couple buds on this poppy, and the poppy will bloom and then the foliage will just die away, only to come up in the fall again to show us where it is. Again, more allium. And the roses were pruned and they're doing well, and I've been able to keep any insects off of them. Right now, the insect to watch for would be the gypsy moth or autumn or winter moth caterpillars, and you need to either squash them or use some sort of organic spray to keep those off. So far I haven't had much damage this year, and I just have been keeping watch more than anything. Plant supports should be in place. This one came in a little late, so it still shows quite a bit, but I'm hoping that the plant will grow right through it and you won't be able to see it. Many of these plants do have supports on them that should be somewhat invisible by now. More iris in the back, and that brings us to some planting. Next to this tree peony. There are 2 types of peonies, and the first to bloom is the tree peony. This one is one that does not die back in the winter. It forms kind of a bush. And this one, I have 3 of them. I have a pale pink, a white, and this dark pink, bright pink. And they've done really well this year. They must need a real nice cold winter because they have done extremely well. I do not protect them anyway in the winter, and they look really tropical. I think they're beautiful. They don't last too long, unfortunately, but while they do last, I really do enjoy them. Some herbs I plant here in the flower garden, and one of them is pineapple sage. And that's going to go in this location. And I'm going to dig a hole and put that in. It'll get about 3 feet tall, so it will take up some space where these tulips and hyacinth foliage is ripening off. Again, tulips and hyacinths, you need to leave the foliage. Don't take it out until it's brown. And loosen the soil quite a bit here, and we'll plant the pineapple sage. Pineapple sage, again, is a very tender herb, and it has a lovely pineapple flavor and aroma. However, those do not last if you happen to cook it. So you can use it fresh in a fruit salad or just enjoy it in your garden. It is an annual in our climate. Perhaps in a very, very southern climate, it is perennial. But here, it's something that you have to plant annually. I have had no luck at all in bringing it in for the winter. So I just buy a new one every year. And again, water it in well. As I move along the perennial garden, we have some English bluebells and a little more rhubarb that's interspersed. I will be putting in a salvia, some lemongrass, And I have placed here to put in later today a heliotrope, another tender annual, which is sometimes called an herb. It's more used for its lovely smelling flowers, which smell kind of like baby powder if you were. This is another Siberian iris, an early blooming one called Roaring Jelly, and that's why I bought it, because I was very interested in the name. And I think it's pretty. It's a little shorter than taller ones, and it has an interesting little zone on the petals here, kind of speckled and several different colors in it. But it's mostly a lovely blue, and it really adds a spark of color. Again, we have daisies. These are just the common daisies, everyday daisies, and once they've bloomed, I'll cut them way back. They tend to spread rather easily, so I usually have a bunch and plenty to share with other people. More poppies, phlox. And also, this is a geranium that's been here for several years now. And now is the time to start pinching geraniums so that they'll be full. And what I'll do is just take out the centers of each of the leaflets where the stem comes up. And we just want to take probably about a ½ inch out of the middle. What this does is causes the plant to branch. This can be used on other plants too. And if they're too tall, it helps to shorten them. But this will encourage this plant to form branches and have more flowers. I'll continue to do this process until about the 4th of July. After that, no more pinching. It will be done, and then it will form its buds for fall bloom, early fall bloom for the ones that have stayed in the garden. Another one of the large alliums. And then back here I have a smaller allium that will pop into bloom soon. So they come in all sizes. And again, the deer don't like them. If you have full sun, alliums are a nice plant to grow. This is another one. This is not quite as large, but it will slowly develop into about a softball-sized bloom. And they just add a lot to the garden. They're also long-lasting, and the blooms can be cut after they have completely bloomed. You can leave them in the garden for a while as a decorative accent. The seed pod or the flowering pod is quite attractive, or you can pick them for winter and fall arrangements, which is what I do. And sometimes I even spray paint them gold, which looks nice in an arrangement, or any other color. Again, another perennial geranium. This one is a very common one. I don't know that it's native, but it's somewhat related. I do have native ones in the back, which grow in my shade garden. And then we have a few more things that are starting their bloom cycle, and more iris, just the German iris, and more bulbs that will be going to seed. Hopefully the perennials that are near and around them will help cover them for the duration. And any other chrysanthemums, I'll come in and pinch those back too so that they'll become more full. Again, another geranium here. This is a maculatum geranium. It is, again, a perennial geranium, slightly different, a little bigger. It will have bright pink blooms in another week. And this one is more of a native type. We'll see some natives later in the shade garden. The other plant I have here is a Camissa, and it sends up, this one has variegated foliage, and it sends up spikes of blue flowers now, not too tall. I have lilies that are about to bloom, and this one has been a favorite of the lily beetles. Right now it seems to be okay, but I've had to watch this one quite a bit. Before I move on to the vegetable garden, I just want to add that I'll be moving some of the perennials now for the next week or so. Then I want to leave things alone and let them bloom. But my goal in this perennial garden is to have something in bloom, in flower, pretty much from Memorial Day on through Labor Day and probably through the month of September and into October. I like to have something in bloom that I can enjoy, maybe pick and bring inside and just enjoy throughout the season. So it involves a little planting and a little moving of plants from time to make sure I have the right blend of colors during each season. Now let's move on to the vegetable garden. The lettuce starts that we put in, I started in my little sun shed, are ready to pick, so we can make salad now without buying any lettuce for a long time. Celery's doing well, and I've put in some small starts of cabbages along here as well. Broccoli starts, again, I started those in my shed, and it's proved to be a very successful way to do it. I'm still planting a lot of seeds, and I'm going to be planting some herbs. I like to wait until it's warmed up some in order to plant things like basil, and that's what I'm going to plant today. And I'll plant a whole row of different herbs in this area. A little bit of each one, a little more of the basil, because we like it very much. This doesn't need to be planted too deep. I'm going to have to take off the glove. Cannot plant little seeds with gloves on. And they are little, just little black seeds. And I'm going to just sprinkle them very gingerly along and move down a little ways too. And then I'm going to put a rock there to mark where I ended and use my trowel to lightly cover those seeds with some soil. I have very rocky soil in this garden. To say it's well drained is a conservative statement. But it does seem to grow things, and we keep growing. And then we'll pat them down well. And hopefully they'll get a little water from either me or Mother Nature. And that will get the growth process started. The next thing I want to plant are green beans. And I'm using the same legume inoculant that I used with the peas, and I'm just going to sprinkle it in with my seeds and kind of shake it around. So that a little bit gets on each of the bean seeds. And again, these all space about 1.5 to 2 inches apart as I go down the row. And may need to use my trowel to open up the row a little bit, get the rocks out. Put a few more seeds in. I'll continue this row for a little bit more later on. Again, I want to cover those with more. Each seed should be covered with about 3 times its depth. So that isn't a whole lot of soil for the small basil seeds, but it's a little more for things like beans and squash. And again, we'll pat those down well. And they should be up very quickly with some warm weather here. It shouldn't take too long before the beans come up. While I'm in this section, I want to point out the wires. They may be hard to see from a distance, that's intentional, but I have a line of 4 wires in this area and 2 to 4 in other areas around the garden. This is to keep deer and other animals out of my garden. It works quite well. The lower wire tends to keep out the woodchucks and the rabbits. They don't burrow under it. They hit the wire once, and I don't know whether they get confused or what, but they don't tend to dig a burrow underneath like they would with a wire fence. The shock seems to do it. It's a light shock. I have gotten zapped several times. It's not pleasant, but it is not lethal. And the charger is in the garage hooked up, and we turn it on or off. But it does, the higher wire tends to keep the deer out of the garden. Having lost maybe a whole row of beans one year to woodchucks and deer, you need to do something to keep the wildlife out, whether it's a wire fence, which I have in the back, or an electrified fence, something that will allow you to harvest your vegetables if you live in an area like I do, where there's just wild areas all around me, and wild animals, and they do get in here. The next thing I want to plant, and I better take my glove with me, would be some squash. And I've got everything lined out for planting. I've decided where I'm going to put my peppers and my tomatoes. I've got my tomato cages. I've got a teepee up for cucumbers. I need to put another one up for some pole beans that I'd like to plant. And hopefully over this weekend, which is Memorial Day weekend, I will have the time to get out and finish all of the planting. That's always my goal, to get things done around Memorial Day. And hopefully that will work out this year. I have lots of cilantro that volunteered in the garden, and also borage. These plants are not weeds, they're borage. And borage is another herb that has lovely blue flower and a flavor of cucumber that can be added to salads. And the cilantro, great with Mexican food, great with beans and corn and other things. And so I just let those grow until they go to seed, and then I'll pull them out. But we'll use those. I'll plant some seeds of both for a later crop. But the ones that have volunteered or come up from seeds of other plants, I will leave in the garden. I make hills when I plant my squash. And I'm going to plant summer squash in this one. This is a zucchini. And these are the 8-ball zucchini, which I like. They are round zucchini, which is a little different. And I plant them in hills. And I made a hill of compost. Hopefully give them a good start. And I'm just going to poke in about 4 or 5 of these seeds into each hill. And then pat it down well. And again, with water, they should come up. At some point, I will keep the 2 or 3 best plants in this group and snip off the others. We'll see how they germinate. So that's about all the planting I'm going to do today, but in the future, I will be planting the rest of my herbs, some annual flowers, which zinnias, marigolds, that sort of thing. And also my tomato plants, pepper plants, and eggplant will all go here. Right now they're resting in the sun shed and continuing to grow. We've had some cool nights, but I think now we've finally turned the corner and summer will be upon us, and we can continue putting in the tender vegetables. Now let's go into the shade garden before we roast to death out here. Last year I grew some canna lilies, and canna lilies are tall lilies that bloom in the early fall and right into fall, usually with pink or red blooms and large leaves, and they get about this tall. And I'm going to put some in this pot in hopes they'll grow. They multiply quite well, so I have quite a few to plant. I put a few in the perennial garden, and I put a few in another flower garden, and I'll be putting some also in my pond because they also don't mind wet feet. But I'm going to put them in the middle of this large pot and cover them up, and then hope that we see a bunch of them come up in a couple weeks. You divide them up so that each section has at least one eye, and it's pretty easy to tell what an eye is. It's a little growing point. This is one of the cuttings that I grew. It's a plectranthus, and it grew inside all winter, and it is ready to move out, as are a number of other plants that I started, but that really cuts down on my buying of annuals if I have a few of the things that I've started from cuttings to add to my pots. I can add the new annuals, but having some of these really helps. And this one is actually in bloom. Usually I take the blooms off and I'll keep it deadheaded, and it should bloom pretty much all summer. I also have a silver gray plectranthus. It's a common house plant, and those will also go into this garden. Hopefully my vision is to have the tall spike of the canna lily in the center. The hosta I stuck in here because I didn't have any place to put it once when I was dividing plants, and lo and behold, it came back up. I forgot about it, and here it is, and this is about the third year that it's growing here. In fact, it grew well enough that I cut a piece off the side of it a week ago and planted it outside in one of my other shade gardens. So it grew enough so that I could divide it. It's done really well in this. It's a mixture of mostly compost in this pot, so it's no wonder that it's doing extremely well. It also stays moist because it's near the water faucet and I can water it often. We have Brunera in bloom right now in the shade garden, and I have the plain green leafed variety. I love their heart-shaped leaves. A little carex grasses. I have a fine textured one, which is right here, and then I have one that's a little bolder texture that I also use. It's a little thicker. This is another Brunera, and it again has the heart-shaped leaves, but this one is variegated, and the name of this one is Jack Frost, which you might guess. And there are several others with different patterns on the leaves, and the patterns will stay all summer, and it too will have some blue flowers on it. I love the blue flowers of just the straight species of it. I have Stilbe in here and a little hosta. Again, with the hosta, you have to watch for slugs and deer damage. So they get the pellets for slugs frequently, and also some spray for deer damage. I do have deer that come into the backyard, not too often, but often enough that they can destroy 3 or 4 hosta in one sitting. They really like it, especially when it's young and tender. Moving back, I've started to move some house plants out. The hosta and ferns have really come into their own. I have in here also epimedium with their little heart-shaped leaves mixed in. They had the little fairy-like blossoms. The blossoms are gone, but the leaves remain as a nice ground cover. A few bulbs blooming of the Spanish hyacinth, which is a bell shape little plant. It likes the shade a little more, and it has little blue bells. They're a little later than many of the other bulbs. Tiarella with little starry spikes is also in bloom now. This is probably the season when the shade garden has its most color. Bleeding heart, and I've moved out a few of my house plants. This one is an oxalis, a purple one that I keep in the house. I have several of them. It's now in bloom as well with little pink blossoms, and it will spend the summer outside to move in the fall, possibly be divided. What you see on the ground here is not grass, but crocuses. And the little spring crocuses that were in bloom, again, have to go to complete brown before I can remove them. So they look all this world like grass that's taken over here, but it isn't. And I may cut a hole in it in the middle to plant something else. But you can tell the difference between a crocus and grass by the leaf. I don't know if you can get a close-up of this, but the crocus leaf has a little white line in the middle, and grass does not. Therefore, when I'm weeding in here, I can look for that white line and know to leave it. Whereas if it has no white line, I'll pull it out as a weed. It really helps if you notice the small things. And again, these were the little early blue crocuses that carpeted this area, and they grew quite large foliage after they bloomed. And again, that will stay for about another month, and then gradually it will disappear and turn brown. Let's head back to the pond. Okay, I finally got my pond cleaned by removing a goodly amount of the water and replacing it with fresh water, and set up a filter system, a natural filter. I don't have, it's just a biological filter, which is a bag of filter media, and it will work with the natural bacteria of the pond. It sits in the waterfall container. There's a pump on the bottom of the pond that pumps into the waterfall container, and then the water returns through a skimmer, which will take out most of these lovely maple, what we used to call airplanes, the maple seeds that are now falling from the trees. Believe it or not, this deck was swept about 2 hours ago, but it's now covered again with lovely little maple seedlings. Fortunately, most of those will be taken out of the pond. I did get 6 fish. I would love to show them to you, however, I can't see them. I got tiny fish. They didn't look quite as tiny in the store, but once I put them in the pond, they're pretty much doing a disappearing act right now. I think they have are a little awed at their wide world, and occasionally you can see one down in there. They are gold, and they will get bigger, so we'll watch those as they develop, and I'll feed them about once a day now. As it gets warmer and the water's warmer, I'll feed them a little more often. Also, as they get bigger, they will need more food. Right now, they don't need a whole lot. And again, there are 6 tiny fish in there, but they're mostly hiding behind some of the plants and under some of the equipment. I'm in the process of adding plants to the pond. As I mentioned, I will be putting in a canna lily in a pot. And I have here another elephant ear, which is a large colocasa, and it's a large bulb, which I ordered. This is dormant right now. And I'm going to put it, dig down into a bucket of just garden soil. Soil I took out of the vegetable garden, actually. And I want to put this in here so that it's mostly buried. And right in the middle. Leave the top out a little bit. And then I'll add this pond media. If I were to put this in the water right now, all the soil would start floating out. So this is a clay product that's used in the bottom of aquariums and with aquatic plants. And I just put a nice layer of that on top. And then we'll set that right into the pond, and that will give it all the water it needs. And I'll try to find as sunny a spot as I can. You'll notice it's raining maple seeds right now. In a few weeks, those will be finished and we can clean up and hopefully not have to clean the pond filtering system quite as often. But this will pull them out as they fall in the pond, so I'm glad I was able to get the pond set up and ready before they started falling. I have a variety of planters. Again, I found that this pot fits inside this planter very nicely, and I'll be filling that in a short time with some annual plants that like the shade. I have a variety of impatiens that we grew inside, and those will come outside and be put into planters anytime. And any of the tender plants can come out now, the tropicals. You be aware that if the temperature does drop significantly before 40, you're going to have to cover them or bring them in someplace. But I doubt that's going to happen now. We're at the end of May. We should be pretty dependably above 50 at night. Now I want to show you some other plants on the other side of my shade garden. This is the other side of the shade garden. I have a pond on one side, and the garden actually goes kind of all the way around. And this is the side that gets kind of part sun at this point. We've lost a couple trees, so I think it gets a little more sun than it once did. And a lot of the things that you see in here are wild. Some are not. I've just kind of edited the wild by adding different plants. I've added some hosta, several varieties, and I added English bluebells, which are back there. You can see those, and there's more also on the other side. Woodland phlox is in here. That's the blue plant back that way. This is the wild geranium, Geranium maculatum, I believe, and it just came. I never planted it. It arrived. It's a wildflower, and it is very pretty right now. It will soon be finished, and then it just settles into being green all during the season. Behind it, I did plant the blue columbine, and I let that go to seed and hope that it spreads even further. I really do like it, and it adds a lovely touch of color. There's a little camissa here and there and back. Again, it's had blue spikes, but it will soon be gone. I've moved a few things around back here, and will continue to do so. I have astilbe that will bloom a little later that I've added, and Angelica gigas, which will bloom into the fall. So trying to keep some color in here, but mostly this is a green garden, a serene garden most of the year with the plants mostly green. Now let's go inside and see what we can cook with a few of the early things we can get from the garden. We're in the kitchen to make a few things using some seasonal things. And the first thing I'm going to do is start some water boiling, and I'm going to make some rhubarb and lavender syrup, or rhubarb and lilac syrup. I picked the last of my lilacs. The lilacs are almost gone, but this is a syrup that I read about, which sounded really interesting. So we use 3 or 4 good stalks of rhubarb. It's been cut in 1.5 inch pieces. And I'm putting that with a 1/2 cup of sugar. And a handful, this was in the recipe, a handful of lilac petals. And they have to be removed from the stalk itself. I'm going to stir that until it starts to simmer, and then we're just going to let it simmer. And it needs to simmer for 15 or 20 minutes. Rhubarb is best served in cooked things. It's very seldom used raw. I don't think I have a recipe that uses raw rhubarb, but it's cooked in some manner. You can make it into a Jell-O salad, make just rhubarb sauce, which many people like, strawberry rhubarb sauce, strawberry rhubarb pie is a big favorite, which I think I've done, and the various types of tarts, cakes, cookies. Next we're going to make some muffins once this starts to boil. Okay, now it's come to a nice hard boil, and I will turn the heat down to low. I put the lid on, and we will just let that simmer away while we go on and make something else. The something else being rhubarb pecan muffins. And I'm starting with 2 cups of flour, and then I will add 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. Because there's some acidic ingredients in this, we use both baking powder and baking soda. I'll also add sugar, 3/4 of a cup. What I'm doing is mixing it by a method called the muffin method. Believe it or not, it's where you mix all the dry ingredients together, and then you mix the wet ingredients together. 3/4 of a cup of orange juice, a 1/4 cup of cooking oil, and 1 egg. And then I'll mix it in with the flour just until things are barely dampened. Muffins are best when you don't over-mix them. Muffins that have tall peaks and lots of tunnels are not a standard product. I'm going to now add 2 teaspoons of grated orange peel. And 1 1/4 cups of rhubarb, which has been diced, and I use my nice red rhubarb, so that we'll have a lot of nice color. And 3/4 cup of chopped pecans. And again, I'm just going to mix this mixture until everything's been incorporated and I don't see any more dry ingredients. Muffins are one of the easiest things to make and a good thing for a beginning cook, young person to start out making. I'm going to fill a muffin tin. Even it out. This does make a dozen. I did grease also the top of the pan in case they pop up over the top. Make nice muffin tops. Then they should come out of the pan a little more easily. We're going to put those into the oven at 350 for 25 to 30 minutes. And I will set the timer on that one. And we'll come over and make something else while our items are cooking. I'm going to make a dip that's almost Memorial Day, time for some picnics to get started. So I'm going to make what's called a creamy Tuscan spread. It has a lot of ingredients, none of them are too difficult, but it has all the flavors of, supposedly, of Tuscany. And I'll start out with a 8-ounce block of cream cheese. And to that I'm going to add a teaspoon of minced garlic. And this. And we are in danger of boiling over here, so we'll turn it down even further. There we go. A 1/4 teaspoon of salt. About 7 ounces of chopped artichoke hearts. I'm going to stir some of this to get it going a little. The things that we're adding add some moisture, so that helps with the cream cheese, which was softened, but it's still a little hard. It is a spread, so you don't want it too thin. If it were a dip, why, we could add some cream or milk or yogurt to make it dippable. We have more ingredients to add. And I'm going to add about 2½ tablespoons of black olives. About 3 green onions, which have been chopped. And our green onions in the garden are ready that we can pick a few, and so that's one of the things that we've been able to put in. 3 ounces, or 1.5 ounces, I'm sorry, of sun-dried tomatoes, and these are tomatoes that we dried in the oven last year and kept in the freezer all winter. And now I'm ready to use them. 2 tablespoons of chopped parsley. And last but not least, about a teaspoon and a half of chopped chives from the garden. So we're getting a little of our garden produce in here. And then we just want to mix it around well. Ideally, you would refrigerate this overnight for the flavors to really blend. And what I'm going to do is put it into another bowl for serving. And I want to garnish it a little bit. Again, if I'm taking it to a picnic, I can use a little of the parsley on the top. And then I'm going to make a tomato rose. I've done this before, but it was worth doing again. It's one of the garnishes that I really like to make. And I have a small tomato here. Unfortunately, not a garden tomato yet. They will come. And I'll core it. I'm using a thin knife blade, and I'm going to peel the tomato in a circle. Making every attempt to keep my peeling thin and continuous. First time you do it, have 2 tomatoes, just in case. And we're getting near the end. Start at the bottom. And if you break it, just keep going. And then you can just set it on top, and it makes a nice rose shape. Pull it up. And to serve this, I'll put it on a tray and put some crackers in with it. Or you could use cucumber or another vegetables with it. All right, some nice plainer crackers. And I'll put a couple rows of those down the. We want them that way. I think we're ready to take it off the heat and strain it. I have a little strainer here. another spoon or spatula. Let's see what we've got. We're going to stop a minute. I have to get something to press it. Yep. So I'm going to reach for the spoon. Okay. Probably could cook it a little longer, but we'll do it anyway. Okay, now we'll take a spoon and press all these solids out of our syrup. You'll notice that the rhubarb is really cooked down. And what's left is a lovely pink syrup. Probably got a little color from the lilacs. If you had dark color lilacs, I suspect it might be even a darker purple shade. If you plan to use it as a syrup for serving on ice cream or something, you might want to cook it down just a little bit more, just after it's been strained. You would reduce it, which would saturate the solution a little bit more and give you more concentrated syrup. For this, I will, in order to keep it, I'll pour it into a clean glass jar. Not all of it. I'm going to save some of it out. And I'll cap it. This is not a preserving method. It is a keeping method. And I'll just cap it up and then we'll put it in the refrigerator as is. And we have a lovely pink syrup. And we can also make a beverage with it. I have a glass of ice. And I'll pour the warm syrup over that. And then add some seltzer. And you can adjust the amount of syrup you add. And probably stir that. You have a nice pink beverage. We lost a little ice in the process. So that gives us a nice refreshing beverage. And we need a couple knives with our spread. And let's see how the muffins are doing. Our muffins seem to be done. We can take them out of the oven and bring them over with the rest of the items. So this concludes today's walk in the garden with a little trip to the kitchen too. I'm Liz Davey, and these are our rhubarb items, our rhubarb and seltzer, rhubarb syrup and seltzer, rhubarb and pecan muffins, and we made a Tuscan dip for any cookouts that you might be invited to. I'm Liz Davey, and you've been watching A Walk in the Garden on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable Television. Join me again when we do another show in a couple of weeks.